Today, I'm going to share with you my DJI Pocket 3 workflow for achieving cinematic results, including camera settings, exposure method, camera movements, and color grading. I've been polishing this workflow for the last 6 months, and I guarantee you that after watching this video, you'll get much better results with your Pocket 3. With that said, let's start with the camera settings. For resolution, I only shoot in 4K because it provides the highest image quality. As for frame rate, I mostly shoot at 25 frames per second because I live in a PAL country. If you live in an NTSC country, I recommend switching to 24p. However, in cases where I need slow motion, I shoot at 50p or even 100p. A quick tip: to access high frame rate slow motion on the Pocket 3, tap the camera icon at the bottom left corner of the screen and swipe left until you see the slow motion mode. Unfortunately, as of now, it's impossible to access high frame rate slow motion in the normal video mode. Moving on, inside the image adjustment menu, I select costume and set the sharpness to -2 and the noise reduction to -1. This completely removes artificial sharpness and slightly reduces the noise reduction in camera, which makes the image look more natural. Personally, I like my shots to be on the softer side without too much noise reduction, but if you prefer your shots to be sharper and slightly cleaner, you can always increase the sharpness either in camera or in post-production and bump up the noise reduction. However, I would not go higher than 0 with the noise reduction because then the image looks very unnatural. Moving on, I mostly use single point focus because it allows me to lock the focus and prevent the camera from focus hunting. However, if I need to track a subject or if I am vlogging, I'll switch to continuous focus and double tap on the screen where the subject is located to start tracking. For the most part though, I use single point focus because it gives me more accuracy and control over where I want to focus. For example, I like including foreground objects in my shots, and this is much easier to do with single point focus mode because I can just tap on the screen to focus on the background and get my shot without worrying about the camera trying to focus on something else. If I try the same thing using continuous focus mode, it will usually introduce focus hunting, which will deliver poor results. There is no right or wrong here, you just need to figure out what focus mode to use for your specific scenario. I mostly use single point focus because I do quick bursts of shots of like 10-15 seconds maximum, but maybe if I was doing something more complex, I would switch to continuous focus mode. It all depends on the scene, and I suggest to you to practice and see what really works the best for you. Anyway, as for color, I always shoot in D-Log-M because it provides the widest dynamic range and the most flexibility in post-production when color grading. I turn the glamour effect off because it looks silly. As for the white balance, I always set it manually to get the most natural looking image and avoid unnecessary corrections in post-production. However, if you are not sure what white balance setting to use, you can always switch it to automatic, let the camera find the most optimal Kelvin value and then lock it by switching it back to manual. This won't give you the best results. I would still recommend using manual white balance as much as possible, but it's still going to be much better than having the camera always looking for the right Kelvin value for your scene. Moving on to exposure, I always use manual exposure. This provides the most control over the camera's exposure and the best results. Regardless, I always keep the shutter speed double the frame rate to achieve the cinematic natural motion blur in my shots. This means if I film in 25p, I set it to 1/50. If I film in 50p, I set it to 1/100. And if I film in 100p, I set it to 1/200. If you want to achieve cinematic results with any camera for that matter, having the shutter speed set to double the frame rate is really important. However, in most cases, if you do so, it will overexpose your shots, which is why I recommend using ND filters. These filters basically act as sunglasses for your camera, allowing you to lower the shutter speed as much as you want without worrying about your shot being overexposed. I use and recommend these filters from Freewell. They're not cheap, but they're very high quality and easy to use. I've made a video about both of these. You can check them out down below. As for ISO, I try to keep it as low as possible, preferably at 50 all the time, but if I'm lazy to change the ND filter to get proper exposure, I'll sometimes bump it up to ISO 100 or even ISO 200, and when shooting in low light, I'll go as high as ISO 1600, which still delivers relatively clean results. Basically, the idea here is to keep the ISO as low as possible to get the least amount of noise in your shots, but the Pocket 3 has such good noise performance that even if you increase the ISO to 100, 200 or even 400, you will not notice that much of a difference because the noise performance of this camera is really that good. Alright, to expose my shots, I mostly rely on the camera screen or the exposure metering right here in the corner. Neither of these is 100% accurate, but it gives you a rough idea of what's happening in terms of exposure. Also, I recommend going to the brightness settings and set the brightness as high as you can, just to make it much easier to expose your shots, because I find the display on the Pocket 3 to be pretty accurate in terms of judging exposure. Anyway, let's expose this shot. I'm gonna go to the exposure menu and I'm gonna set my shutter speed to 1/50, double the frame rate. ISO is set to 50, and I can see right now I'm pretty much overexposed by 2 stops. It says +2, so I'm gonna use an ND filter with 2 stops, probably ND32, to expose the shot correctly. So let me put it on. All right, now I have ND32 on and it still says +1.3. It means it's a bit too overexposed, so I'm gonna put ND64 instead. But with the ND64, it looks much better. It says here +0.3, which is not ideal. Ideally, for this kind of scene where there is not a lot of contrast between highlights and shadows, I would have the EV compensation set to 0. But I'm looking at the display and everything looks completely fine for me, so I can just focus on the background and get my shot. Now, if you're shooting in a more complex scene where you have a high contrast between the shadows and the highlights, you'll have to make some sacrifices. And personally, what I do in these kind of cases is I expose for the highlights because I think it looks the best, unless the main subject is directly in the shadows, which then I would expose for the shadows. Just by looking at the display, I think I am properly exposed now for the highlights, but let's go to the exposure menu. And the EV says -0.7, which is exactly what I want it to be when exposing in these kind of scenes. I want it to be at roughly -1, -0.7, because I want to protect my highlights as much as possible, and I don't really care about the shadows. Let me press record to show you how it looks. You can probably see that the shadows are completely crushed in here, but personally, I don't really care about that because I mostly care about preserving the highlights as much as possible. Now, if I had a subject walking here in this scene, I would probably bump up the exposure. Now, I'm not going to change the ND for that because I kind of feel lazy at the moment, so I'm just going to bump up the ISO. I would probably put the ISO to 100 if I just had someone walking in this frame. So let me show you how this looks. And right now you probably can see that the highlights are slightly overexposed, but you can see definitely more information in the shadows, which is what you want if you have a subject in here. But if I had a subject directly in front of the camera speaking to the camera, I would completely blow out the highlights and expose for the shadows or for the subject. And the way I would do it is by removing the ND filter or just bumping up the ISO. Let's go with the ISO here just to make it easier. And I'm going to use my hand as a guideline. So I put my hand in here and I can see I somewhat look okay. I think I can even increase it to ISO 800. Yeah, I think it here I would be properly exposed. All right, so now I'm in front of the DJI Pocket 3 and I think I am properly exposed. Maybe I'm a bit too bright, I don't know. Let's try it now with slightly less exposure, and now it's with the ISO set to 400. What do you think, which one looks better, the one with the higher exposure or with the lower one? Let me know in the comment section down below. All right, so as you can see, you pretty much always have to make some sacrifices when it comes to exposure, unless you're shooting in a very wide open area where everything is equally bright. In that case, you just expose until the exposure meter on the camera says +0.0, and also use your eyes and see if everything looks correctly on the screen. But if you're shooting in a contrasty scene where you have a high difference between the shadows and the highlights, you have to decide whether to expose for the highlights, whether to expose somewhere in between, or to expose completely for the shadows. Now, if I'm doing something like vlogging, I don't use manual exposure because it's not really that practical, but also I don't use fully automatic settings either. Instead, I still use manual exposure mode with the shutter speed set to 1/50, the ISO set to auto, but no higher than ISO 800, and an ND8 or ND16 mounted on the camera to keep the exposure neutral. This will still provide the natural motion blur in my shots, and the Pocket 3 footage is so clean that even if the camera goes up to ISO 800 once in a while, it won't be that noticeable, and personally I prefer my shots having the natural motion blur than having less noise. But if you want your shots to be as clean as possible, I would recommend using automatic settings, full automatic settings, because it's going to be much easier when vlogging. Moving on to my gimbal settings, for the most part I use the tilt locked gimbal mode as it gives me more precision with my camera movements. However, if I'm vlogging or tracking a subject, I usually switch to the follow gimbal mode. Also, I mostly use the gimbal's default rotational speed because it looks the most natural. However, on some occasions I switch it to the slowest setting if I want a very gradual camera movement. Speaking of camera movements, here are my personal favorites. The first one is the push in, pull out. With this movement, you essentially push the camera forward or backward on the same axis. It works really well for background reveal shots by pulling the camera away from your subject or showcasing a symmetrical location. The second one is the up down boom, which works on the same principle as the push in, pull out, but instead of moving the camera horizontally, you move it vertically up or down. It works really well for revealing shots or when you need to transition from a higher point of view to a lower one and vice versa. And the final one is the slide, which again works on the same principle as the push in, pull out, but this time you move the camera from left to right or vice versa. This is the camera movement that I use the most because it's very easy to do and works well for many things like revealing a subject or following it horizontally. Now, if you want to learn more about camera movements with the Pocket 3, you can watch this video here. In the meantime, here are a couple of tips to make your camera movements a bit more cinematic. First of all, try to use foreground elements to your advantage to emphasize the camera movement as much as possible. Try to reveal your shots by hiding the camera behind the foreground element before starting the camera movement to make it more interesting. Press and hold the joystick to lock the gimbal for complete control. Use a selfie stick to get the camera lower or higher to create unique angles, and keep the movement as slow and steady as possible by implementing the ninja walk for most shots. Alright, now let me show you how I color correct and color grade my Pocket 3 footage from start to finish. I'm now inside DaVinci Resolve and I have here this clip on the timeline shot in 4K 100p. Let's start. First thing I'm going to do is add my power grade just to make it a bit easier and faster. So I'm going to click in here and I have here this Rec 709 power grade. And the reason I'm using a Rec 709 power grade is because the Pocket 3 only shoots in a Rec 709 color space. It doesn't do a true log format, even though D-Log M is kinda log. It's not a true log like on my Sony camera, for example, or any other camera. So the first thing I do always is I convert my footage from log to DaVinci Wide Gamut, or from Rec 709 to DaVinci Wide Gamut in this case, because I always work in this color space. It gives the most color information when color grading, and I want to work in the widest color space possible to get the best results. So basically here I have Rec 709 going to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and then in here I have DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate go to Rec 709, but Rec 709A because I'm using a Mac computer. If you use a Windows computer, you should use Gamma 2.4. Alright, so the first node here is noise reduction. I'm not going to do anything with noise reduction in this shot. I'm going to delete this node. And this node is where I adjust the exposure and contrast. I don't think I need to adjust the exposure in here, but I definitely need to add some contrast. I'm gonna go to my color wheels, my primaries, and I'm gonna decrease the gamma, slightly decrease the shadows, just to add a bit more punch, and slightly increase the highlights. Maybe instead of doing that, I'm gonna go to my curves and just increase this part because I don't want to touch the brightest parts of the image. Let me disable these editable splines. I'm just gonna increase the brightness in here, slightly decrease it in here. Something like this. This is the before and after, before and after. As you can see, now the shot has a bit more contrast to it. Alright, the next node is where I adjust the white balance, and honestly, on this shot I don't really need to do that much. Maybe I can push it slightly towards red because I can see some green hues in here, but this was shot in a green environment, so it kind of looks natural, but still, let's see if it looks better. Yeah, I think I can push it to about 2 on the magenta. And maybe also I'm going to decrease the yellow in here slightly, just like so. I think that's more than enough. All right, the next node is where I adjust my saturation, and the way I do it now is with this color space HSV method. I learned it from the YouTuber Colin Kelly. I hope I pronounced the name right. I'm not gonna go too in depth on how it works and why it's better, but basically it allows you to adjust the saturation individually for the highlights, midtones, and shadows. So I usually add about like 0.4 in the midtones of saturation, and then about something like this in the highlights with the Pocket 3. And I never touch the saturation in the shadows because I prefer my shadows to be as neutral as possible. Next one is the window node, where I add some windows, and I'm definitely going to add a window on this guy in here to make it pop from the background a bit more. I'm gonna go here to the windows, add like a circular window. And I'm going to slightly increase the midtones on him, slightly increase the highlights and reduce the shadows, and maybe I'm also going to increase the detail on him just to make him a bit sharper. And I'm going to add another node on the outside, basically on the background from this guy. And this time I'm going to decrease the midtone just to add a vignette basically around this dude in here. And this is the before and after. As you can see, it makes a huge difference. And also, I kind of don't like this haze in here, this, you know, cloud, I don't know, this hazy thing in here. So I'm going to add another node, and I'm going to create another window. Go to my primaries and slightly play around here with the adjustments. I'm going to decrease the highlights a bit, the midtones, and I think actually this looks good. So this is the before and after, before and after. As you can see, before it was just dominating in terms of exposure compared to the main subject, and now it looks a bit more balanced, if you will. Now I think I'm gonna come back to my contrast and exposure and slightly increase the exposure overall in here, something like this. And here I have my sharpness node, and I'm definitely going to add some sharpness to this shot. I usually add the sharpness in here by decreasing the blur, so I can add more sharpness, less sharpness. Just gonna go to about like 48 with the sharpness. As you can see, if I'm gonna zoom in, this is the before and after. There's definitely a difference. Anyhow, now let's start color grading this shot, making it look a bit more stylish. I'm gonna show you two methods. The first one is the more expensive method with Dehancer plugin, and the second one is with my LUTs. Actually, let's start with my LUTs because it's a bit more easier. So I'm going to add another node after this sharpness node, and my LUTs are designed to be used in a Rec 709 color space, which is why I add this LUT after the conversion in here. I'm gonna right click on here, go to LUT, my LUTs, Pocket 3 and Action 4 LUTs. Yes, these LUTs work with the Pocket 3 and the Action 4, but preferably shot in D-Log-M. Okay, I think for this one I'm gonna choose the Oasis, but let me show you how all of them look. So this is the vintage one. And these LUTs are not designed to be used at 100% intensity. I usually recommend using them at about 60-70%. Maybe in this case like 40% looks good. So this is the vintage 2. This one has a purple tint to it. Let's go to the next one, Oasis, which is one of my favorites, and I think this is the one I'm going to use in this shot. And then I have Oasis 2, and then I have Jungle 1, and I have also Jungle 2. Basically 6 creative LUTs. This is Jungle 2, and also inside that LUT package I have the D-Log-M to Rec 709, which basically will add contrast and saturation, but you can download this LUT for free down below. Okay, so I think here I'm going to use the Oasis one. It looks the best, but I'm not going to use it, of course, at 100% intensity. I'm going to dial it down to about here. Now this LUT in my opinion makes the shot look much better, but I'm still going to do some adjustments to the colors in here. So I'm going to open another node, and I think I'm going to decrease the saturation on this guy in here. I'm gonna go to my hue versus sat curves, click on this guy in here and just reduce the saturation slightly on him. And also I'm going to change the hue of the greens in here slightly. Let me click on this. Something like that, just a little bit. Now another thing I think I'm going to do is just add a bit more exposure in the midtones here, something like this, and now I think it looks fantastic. Alright, now let me show you how I color grade with Dehancer, which is the plugin that I mostly use to color grade pretty much all of my footage. Let's enable that. And I'm going to do a couple of adjustments in here. First of all, I'm going to increase the output to 100%. And then I'm going to change the film stock to Supra. I'm going to play around with this push-pull EV. Play around with the film compression just to compress the highlights a bit more. Here I choose the Kodak 2383 print film. I'm gonna play with this slider in here. I think I'm gonna leave it somewhere around here. It's basically, you know, pushing the image towards the blue or the yellow. Let's play around with the contrast here. Next thing I'm going to do is add some film grain because I like it, but I'm going to reduce the chroma, which basically removes the saturation in the grain. I'm also going to zoom in here, reduce the size a bit, and also reduce the amount, play with the resolution, which basically makes the shot sharper or less sharp. And personally, I like my shots to be a bit soft, so I'm gonna leave it somewhere around here, and I'm gonna slightly remove the grain from the shadows, from the midtones, and from the highlights, something like this. And this is the before and after, before and after. All right, I'm not gonna touch halation, but I am going to add some bloom. I'm gonna add this preset in here, but this is a bit too strong for me, as you can see, before and after, before and after. So I'm going to play around with this slider in here. I'm going to leave it somewhere around here. And I think I'm pretty much done, but I'm not going to use it at 100% intensity. I'm going to go to my output menu here and slightly decrease the output to about here, I think. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it to be informative. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. Also, while you're there, check out my LUTs. And if you decide to buy the Dehancer for yourself, which I highly recommend, use my code down below, which will give you a 10% discount on all Dehancer's products.